The Fellows Award, AAA Fellows Award, is a national office award to people who have given distinguished service in support of Australia's international relations. And the fellowships can cover a whole range of people in various dimensions of that. But journalism is a very important part of it. And as you will have read in the flyer that went out, Graeme Dobell has spent more than 30 years at the sharp end, probably a pencil initially, typewriters, and then up to the whiz-bang sort of technology that we have today. And very much across a whole range of areas of international reporting, and certainly very much into the qualitative end of that spectrum. And so it's a very great pleasure on behalf of the National Office and the branch to present now to Graeme, if I can lift it up, this little paperweight that we have taken.
And that's the call.
Right.
Thank you. As the title said, strange shirts I saw on the way to the summit, or an alternate title which I used in an intro one time, APEC as an exercise in high diplomacy and low fashion. Now, an audience like this doesn't need to be told that APEC actually got going in this town in 1989 in a week of high storms and lashing rains, and it was Melbourne Cup week. The Malaysian Foreign Minister won the book on the cup, and Gareth Evans' nag, which lost in the sweep, was Pacific Mirage. But of course, that timing meant that APEC was the first of the post-Cold War institutions. So, with that as prologue, we come to the first summit, which is pretty vague. That's actually Keating there. He was the only one in a sweater that had anything that actually looked vaguely interesting, and it was at Blake Island in Seattle. As Clinton said, Keating had a lot to do with getting this thing happen. Clinton said a couple of years later that the beauty of Keating was that he always knew how to punch the frog. And when Keating wanted something, he could always punch it along. And that's really what this was about. And this first summit was one of the most successful of the series, in a sense. Just holding it was a huge win. And the meeting, in this case, was the message. Fuzzy the message there, but anyway. Keating and Howard credited this meeting with what may be APEC's single greatest trade achievement. They both argued that this meeting helped push the 7-year GATT negotiations, the Uruguay round, over the finish line. And that really that 1993 GATT agreement had a lot to do with this, because the Europeans were reasonably happy with a 3-block world, the yen bloc, a Deutschmark bloc and a US dollar bloc. But if it started to look like 1 against 2, the Europeans started to think that the Americans might have had other options to play. So, in a sense, APEC at its beginning really did have a huge impact. And it says something about, I think, APEC, that perhaps its greatest trade achievement was not something that it actually did itself, but something that it helped achieve because of what it might symbolise. And if you accept the Keating-Howard line, I think in terms of the Uruguay round, probably this was the last time that the old European-US monopoly duopoly actually was able to deliver. They were able to go into the green room, cut a deal, and the Uruguay round was delivered. And it still is the last multilateral round standing. At the moment, we've got a WTO, which, as the Americans would say, is 0 for 1. I think the lingering death of Doha does show that the old monopoly, the European-US monopoly, is well and truly dead. And if APEC did have any magic, this magic doesn't really work too well. So, the first summit was in Mufti. It was coats and sweaters. And next year, it was Bogor. And now the die is truly cast. Just so that you guys over here can see, you should be able to see it too. And I mean a guy in the DYE sense. This is us out at Bogor. And this is the one I like. This is Mahathir in the middle here, and even when he was there, he wasn't really there. He was the most unhappy gent that day. He'd been recalcitrant about Seattle the year before, but he could not refuse Suharto. Suharto's great one-line sentence, "I will invite him and I expect that he will come." Although, after Suharto put out his chairman's statement, Mahathir put out his own statement contradicting the chairman's statement. But the point about this was the Bogor goals: free and open trade and investment in the Asia Pacific by 2010 for developed economies and 2020 for developing economies. And that brings us to, if you like, the creed, or perhaps not the Bible, but to the defining construct that APEC at this period really was working on, this idea of open regionalism. And APEC building on the annual summits, seeking to use its free trade targets as both goal and goad. That this is the dream, the open regionalist dream. And the pure view of open regionalism says that APEC will not discriminate against outside economies. It's the logic embedded in East Asia's experience and integration into the rest of the world, into world markets. It's an attempt by governments to follow what the markets were doing already. And in some ways, I think that's a pretty good definition of APEC. APEC is an attempt by governments to, in a sense, follow the logic of what markets were doing. And open regionalism talks about individual countries liberalising unilaterally in their own way, at their own speed. All liberalisation is non-discriminatory. All trading partners benefit equally in their fan, most favoured nation. The process is market-driven, and there is no legally binding treaty. You can see why Washington couldn't get its head around it. The lawyers didn't believe it. But that was what we were going to try and do, and that was certainly what the Bogor goals were all about. So that gets us next year to Osaka in '95. The last attempt really to hold back the shirts. Like Blake Island, it was suits and coats. It was also the Osaka Action Agenda, a framework to try to deliver open regionalism to meet the Bogor goals through dialogue, through cooperation, through benchmarking against each other. This was not going to be a GATT-style negotiating process. This was going to be voluntary and collegiate. And as I say, you can see why Washington was putting it to. But we're up and we're away. And the next year we are in the Philippines. And this is where the shirt battle, in a sense, was finally done and dusted and won. The Philippines got it done by being more conservative than Indonesian batik. But as I say, the die was cast. This was Howard's first APEC summit, and he went as a sceptic. But when we gathered in his suite that night for a drink when it was all over, it was one of the most excited I think I've ever seen Howard in my life, which was funny because the two most excited times I think I have ever seen Keating in my life were after that initial summit in Seattle. When I went into his room that night to do the AM interview, they had to spend 5 minutes calming him down before they let him loose on me because they said he just gabbled. But the following year in Bogor, he was just about leaping over the furniture. Interesting, that Bogor achievement, I went with Keating when he went back in '95 to sign the treaty on security with Suharto, and the difference between the elation of Bogor and that security treaty. I think Keating on the Bogor goals really thought he was kicking with history. Anyway, let me just pull out something I wrote about this day down at Subic, which was a classic Philippines day. It was absolutely chaotic. Nothing worked. The roads were clogged. Half the journos didn't get there. And because I knew the Philippines, I'd actually gone to Howard's people the night before and said, look, this is not going to work. if you want any coverage on the ABC, I'm coming on the plane with you. From Manila down to Subic. I said, no, you can't do that, security, blah, blah, blah. I said, this is the Philippines, we'll get away with it. So I was one of two journos who essentially forced their way onto the Prime Minister of a plane, flew down and actually drove into the suite of houses where the leaders were for the day. So I'm standing outside and I think in a sense saw the moment of conversion for Howard. The Prime Minister had emerged from the front door of the house that he had for the day wearing his traditional Philippine shirt, the barong Tagalog, woven from silk and fibre with a series of panels down the front symbolising rice fields ready for harvest. Right? You who know Howard's character would know how uncomfortable John Howard felt in his outfit. But at that moment, the Sultan of Brunei drove into the house next door and waved as he went into his suite. A few moments later, an armour-plated Cadillac carrying the President of the United States pulled up on the other side. Bill Clinton strode up his front steps and then noticed his next-door neighbour. The US President nearly fell off the steps as he pointed to Howard's shirt, and then loped across the lawn in that sort of puppyish way that Clinton always had. Property values are looking up, said Howard, as the two men converged across the lawn. The half a dozen American security agents who also converged rather took away the spontaneity of the moment. Nevertheless, Howard had the better of it as he shook hands and turned. He turned back to Clinton and said, "Welcome to the neighbourhood. Try not to make too much noise." And the actual winner, the one that I didn't put in there, about 5 minutes later, about three of the Secret Service guys emerged from Clinton's bungalow and raced over to our side, very concerned and urgent business. The President of the United States needed a bottle of tomato ketchup. Tomato sauce. So, you can see we had a lot of fun at APEC. The next year we're in Vancouver, and in a sense, in this non-ASEAN capital, the diverse dress code theme actually takes hold. Jean Chrétien, a French-Canadian smoothie, who went for what I called at the time the aging groover look. And I do think that the leather jackets really are the coolest APEC moment. Even Sahara gets into that. John Howard said that every other APEC shirt he ever got went straight to the pool room when he got home. But this was the one time when he got home when his eldest son nabbed him at the door and said, "Hand it over, Dad, that jacket is just too cool for you." So in Vancouver, APEC endorses a proposal for early voluntary sectoral liberalisation. Don't you love the way we come up with this stuff? EBSL mattered. 15 sectors, individual action plans, updated annually, and agriculture was one of the sectors. And that break takes us essentially to the make and break moment for APEC in some ways. Here we are in Kuala Lumpur in 1998. The Asian financial crisis has raged for a year. A lot of things have gone to ashes in that fire, including, of course, Suharto's leadership. So here's the vegan standing next to Howard. Suharto's gone. And two things are very badly scorched, perhaps damaged forever. One of them is APEC's regional economic credentials. And secondly, the great hopes for a voluntary version of open regionalism. This was the twin smash-up for APEC. The open regionalism project and this disastrous conflagration of East Asian economies. The economies eventually recovered and powered on, but in a sense, APEC never did. And as a regional body, it had found that at the moment of greatest need, it could not offer much. And almost at the moment it was confronting that fact, it was also dealing with EVSL, early voluntary sectoral liberalisation. And this was a meeting where the idea of open regionalism crashed. And the interesting thing was, the country that really crashed it, the country that drove a stake through the heart of this whole open regions and construct was Japan. It was the moment when the early glorious optimistic APEC moment ended. And at this point, actually, in some ways, APEC goes from glorious childhood into adulthood, and on some readings sort of limps towards senility in a very quick sort of fashion. Tim Fisher told me that he thought that the Japanese stance at this APEC could just about have killed off APEC. It was that sort of moment. But anyway, the following year, in a sense, we shift from geoeconomics to geopolitics. We're in New Zealand, and this is the moment where, in a sense, APEC delivers for the region on East Timor. East Timor is going up in flames. The UN votes just happened, and the Indonesians are standing firm. They will not let in a UN-led, Australia with a UN-led mission. And the closer Clinton gets to Auckland from Washington, the more he starts to focus. As Clinton leaves Washington, he's still trying to do up his zipper from the Monica Lewinsky moment, and his focus is on Kosovo and NATO in Kosovo. By the time he gets to Hawaii, Howard's on the phone to him, he's starting to focus on this stuff. By the time he gets here in Auckland, it's obvious that something has to give, and it does. And Habibie gives. The Americans send the CPAC, the Chief of the General Staff, to Washington, to Jakarta, to lean on the Indonesian military. And this, in a way, is, if you like, the leaders' moment working through pure fluke of timing, the fact that the leaders were here, the amount of pressure that the ASEAN leaders were able to put on, and the ASEAN foreign ministers were putting on the Indonesians, both at the foreign minister and president level, and you get an outcome with a solution. One other wonderful APEC story, the New Zealanders, of course, had won the America's Cup. So they have this thing of putting everybody in yachting gear, black yachting jacket, black trousers, and on the jacket is the silver fern. So Howard comes out of the afternoon session. Timor is the story. He's the one leader giving a press conference because, of course, we're 2 hours ahead of Sydney, and John Howard never misses the 6 o'clock news if he can. So he's going to give a presser mid-talks. So he comes out wearing his silver fern jacket, and he comes into the Australian press room where there's about 30 Australian journalists and nearly as many international media because, of course, this is the one presser. And as John Howard emerges and walks to the front, wearing this New Zealand regalia, a low moan starts in the Australian media. By the time Howard has reached the lectern, it is a full-blown roar at our Prime Minister wearing Kiwi regalia. And Howard knew exactly what we were razzing him for. And he got there and he unzipped the jacket and said, "Forgive me, John Eels," which I thought was a pretty good comeback. But afterwards, about 4 of the Americans came to us and said, "Do you always give your Prime Minister a Bronx cheer like that?" And the answer was, only if he's dressed like a kid. But yeah, a very interesting geostrategic moment. So at the end of the first decade, when we get to Brunei, APEC is clearly the key regional institution, significant political and economic achievements, but expectations by the time we get to Brunei in 2000 starting to shrink a bit. In many ways, the level of achievement and the level of expectations had settled. And from here, the parade of coloured shirts was just to flow on. This was the last time Clinton came to APEC. He was only a couple of weeks away from handing over Bush. And in some ways, Brunei was interesting because Clinton was able to go from Brunei, from Bandar, flew to Vietnam, becoming the first American president to go to Vietnam after the war, underlining one of the key points the Americans had always made about APEC from a diplomatic point of view. If you can get the American president to focus on any one issue for 1 week of the year, you've got enough to run for the whole year. And so APEC's, one of APEC's great achievements, particularly for American diplomats throughout the region, is that 1 week of the year they've been able to get an American president to not only visit Asia, but usually give 2 or 3 speeches about Asia. And in terms of the way Washington works, that alone is gold. You have to be a little bit attuned to the Washington way of looking at the world, but nevertheless, it does matter. Brunei, by the way, was where John Howard started to put nails into open regionals, and this was where he announced the start of our first bilateral free trade negotiations, the easy low-hanging fruit. This was where he announced we're going to start doing a bilateral with Singapore. So then, it doesn't get much better than this. This is the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I didn't think it could get any better than this, but stick with me, folks. It can actually get better. But at the time, I really didn't think it could get any better than this. This is not long after September 11. This is that now fading moment when, as the French said, we're all Americans now. And this marked a moment, I suggest, when the Chinese realised that they might have an excellent, relatively unimpeded decade, because the Americans were going to be off hunting Islamic terrorists. And I think the Chinese couldn't, in some senses, believe their luck. And this was their chance to really expose Shanghai to the world too. Shanghai started to really take off. From this date, I must admit my commitment to the APEC gravy train became a bit more intermittent. I was starting to harbour my ABC travel credits so I could track the ASEAN process, which became the East Asian Summit. Journalists, power groupies, and some of APEC's lustre was ebbing, so that by the end of this decade, the end of the first decade of the 21st century, I think you could probably argue quite reasonably well that the G20 had supplanted APEC as the most important multilateral institution for Australia, and the East Asia Summit was of equal importance. So, quickly then through some shirts. Then we're next in Bangkok in 2003, which is where we sign our free trade agreement with Thailand, yet another one of the many little boulders. And then these were okay, although Putin looked absolutely uncomfortable. But then we get to the piece de resistance in Hanoi in 2006. And this, I think, is the best. And see how Howard at the end there, he broke a land speed record because in the time it took him to get from the final photo to us, which was only about 3 minutes till he walked into the room, that disappeared. He was absolutely determined. He was out of that so quickly. It doesn't matter. The only person who looked like they're having a good time was Helen Clark. The rest of them knew they looked like real gooses. But it's just wonderful. It's just brilliant. And of course, we can talk about the shirts, but I think the interesting thing about the shirts, to be serious about it, is that if APEC has delivered any identity, it has this extraordinary idea of the diversity of what we're talking about. And really, in a strange sort of way, this funny idea that Suharto planned it has actually delivered not just great mirth to picture editors around the world, but some semblance of a thought about what a different place, how many different places there are in this Asia Pacific. And now we come to 2007, to the dry as a bone. The man from Snowy River goes to the summit. And it worked all right, although I think that you could make a very, very faint argument that if Howard hadn't been going to host that summit, and if Jeanette had not been going to host that summit, which in fact is what really happened, Jeanette hosted the summit, John was just around to cheer it. It's possible the Liberal Party could have talked him out of staying on in 2007. Although having said that, I must say I don't believe it. I am very much in the John Hewson camp that when it came to this man being Prime Minister, the only way they were going to get him out of the lodge was in a palm box. But nevertheless, part of the story of that amazing year 2007. Now, Obama in Hawaii last year got them all back in suits. No funny shirts for Obama, he's a cool dude. But I would bet you money that at Vladivostok this year, that Putin will again have them in costumes. So, what does it all mean? Some very quick conclusions and then as we come to the 20th APEC summit, what has it meant, what has it achieved? For me personally, it did what journalism is supposed to do for any of its hack foot sloggers. It gave me the most marvellous chance to travel, to think and to write. And it also helped, in fact, it was very much helped me write a book, 400 pages, which is not bad for someone who measures their journalistic output in 30-second slabs. But in terms of what it has done and will do for Australia, I would say, cutting it up very quickly into two separate boxes. One on the economic. I would say to you that APEC was an attempt by Australia to export, to multilateralise into the Asia Pacific its own extraordinary experience in the 1980s. The internal liberalisation that Australia went through in the 1980s was the framework for what Australia was trying to replicate in the Asia Pacific. And that was, in a sense, an external and an internal validating process for Australia, what Australia was trying to do with the free trade process. So, for instance, when the Howard government was looking at backsliding on the planned tariff cuts for the car industry, the argument that seemed to actually carry the day and kept them on track with the cutting the tariff regime for the car industry was the argument that we needed to do that to be true to our Bogle obligations. And that, I think, would probably be one of the few times ever in our history that the car industry didn't manage to twist the arms and kangaroo. And it showed, yet again, a very old story, that the free trade ideal is one worshipped by economists, but ever subject to the superior politics of lobbyists, lawyers, and legislators, not to mention rent seekers and special interests. And those interests are not going to go away, because I think the trade deal that Australia is happily trying to sign up to with the Americans, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Australia actually gets to the finish line of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We are going to be signing up to an American vision of how trade gets done, and we're going to be signing up to a trade deal that will exclude China, which, if you want to think about it, is a very strange trade construct Australia's been agreeing to, and very much not the sort of ideas that we and the Japanese had when we set out on this journey. Geopolitically, far more unequivocal judgment I'd offer you. I would say that in geopolitical terms, APEC has been a huge achievement for Australia and delivered huge benefits for Australia. The questions about Australia and its region are at the heart of much that has driven and troubled Australian foreign policy. The Gillard government's ponderings on the Asian century are but the latest effort. And I often quote a line that Stuart Harris put into his report about the Australian Foreign Service, where he said that one of the great problems for Australia was that it only had one natural ally, New Zealand. And we have been struggling ever since to escape that as a way of considering Australia's place in the world. And what APEC has been very much a part of is this great story of the last 50 years, this idea of Australia as a part of Asia, not a part from Asia. And APEC, in that sense, I think has been a huge plus for Australia, and it still has much to offer, not just in the fashion stocks. Thank you. There you are. A talk about APEC that actually had jokes. or as Gareth said, APEC, 4 adjectives in search of an hour.
Graeme, I'm sure you'd like to take some questions. Who's going to be first?
I'm the ambassador of Finland. So would you say that, thank you, that without Australia there would be no APEC?
No, I wouldn't say that. In fact, I cut some stuff out about Japan. In fact, if you buy my book on it, you'll find a long discussion in that about how, in fact, APEC is as much a Japanese creation as an Australian creation. Followed whole set of Japanese interests and Japanese initiatives. The reason we could do it in a way was that, of course, it's the old Japanese story that nothing will ever happen in Tokyo until MITI and Ganesha go to war. And the free trade approaches that APEC encapsulated was a MITI version of what Asia should be doing for. And of course the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo was absolutely terrified that this would be a MITI. So I would say that Australia was the first among equals in terms of its partnership with the Japanese. We found it much easier to be the front man. We were much less threatening. It's hard to remember that in 1989 Japan was in a sense where China is now. And Japan's importance within East Asia was extraordinary. And this is the year 1989 when APEC was kicked off. The Japanese were opening a new factory in Southeast Asia every 3 days. The Plaza Accord, the change in currency. It's hard to remember how fundamental the Japanese were in the way that Asia's identity was expanding at that point. And also hard to remember that when APEC got going in 1999, it was possible to create an institution with the title Asia Pacific without China as a member. China doesn't join until 1991. The blood from Tiananmen Square falling off the scales. So no, the role of Australia and the role of Japan is fundamental, but really fascinating that when Hawke floats the idea in Seoul in 1989, can brief the Australian hacks on the plane to the idea that the United States was an option, that it was possible to envisage this without the United States being a member. Again, I was the Southeast Asia correspondent at the time. The ASEANs wouldn't believe it and couldn't believe it. And that was what convinced them that the Australians were essentially working as a stalking horse for the Japanese, because of course there was no Japan could ever have signed up to a trade bloc that excluded the United States. They'd have to give back Rockefeller Center for a start. So that there was a lot of happenstance in the way that it was launched and when it was launched. But it was very much a joint Australia-Japanese initiative. And the Japanese had done a lot of the hard thinking. But that's not to take it away from Hawke and Michael Duffy and Gareth Evans, who the day after Hawke gave his rather surprising speech in Seoul announcing this idea, Gareth Evans just happened to be in Washington and had to front up to the American Secretary of State, James Baker. And Gareth always said that the most scarifying meeting he ever had in his life was that meeting with James Baker after Bob Hawke had announced that we could do a regional trade grouping without the United States. Gareth said he had to mark a Zorro on him.
You've shown us how APEC has sort of evolved over time and how certain aspects that were important to its actual creation have sort of died away. How do you see it changing into the future, say 20 years from now?
Well, I think that we spent the first decade doing open regionalism to the best of our ability. It was a great help in getting a gap around. We spent the next decade, in a sense, running away from that with the noodle bowl, with hundreds of bilateral and free trade deals. And we've really, in a trade sense, walked ourselves into a huge cul-de-sac. Asia has, because if APEC was about trying to mirror what the market was doing, trying to mirror the sorts of linkages that the global supply chain was creating, it hasn't done a very good job of following that. And the tensions between, if you like, the Washington view of the way you do trade and the way Asia has actually done trade for quite a few decades now, those tensions are, again, I think, very, very clearly evident in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Really interesting set of ideas about how much what Mickey Mouse and Apple need and what Washington wants can be accepted by Asia. And I think the answer is a lot of that can't be accepted. So in terms of how you deal with the noodle bowl and in terms of how you then look at some of what the Americans want, APEC in a sense is the place where some of the compromises can be made. Doha is life support. And therefore you've got to think of other ways of doing it. And I think APEC as an existing structure is as good a place to think through some of that stuff as anywhere else. And anything, as I say, where you get the President of the United States and the President of China and the rest of it is a good starting point. So that it will be part of the continuing conversation.
For that presentation, Mr. Dobell. You mentioned in your speech the Asian financial crisis at the end of the last century, the late 90s, and the creation of the G20 in the subsequent century. Would you see the emergence of the G20 as the most important international institution, minimizing the significance of the APEC bloc?
Yes. Yeah. I think regionalism has lots to offer. I mean, there's all sorts of levels that regionalism was important, both geopolitically as well as geoeconomically. But really, the G20 is an acknowledgement that you were talking about global supply chains, global investment flows, all of those sorts of realities. And it's also, it has other realities too. It is, if you like, part of the sort of the post Vasco da Gama era. 500 years of Europe running everything. Hey, it ain't so no more. And the G20 is a very good example of that. And I think that moment in 2008, when the G20 had their first leaders summit in Washington, convened by George W. Bush a couple of weeks before he leaves office, and all these leaders who had almost exactly a decade before, in 1998, were being told what bad boys they were. The Asian financial crisis. The World Bank's going to fix you, baby, and the IMF's going to fix you. And Asia turns up in Washington in 2008 at the G20, being begged or asked to help save global capitalism. The Thais and a few others that I've spoken to said it was a wonderful moment. It's a changing of the guard, but it's a changing of the guard which has a huge Asian element in it. And in terms of some of the ways that things have to be worked through, I think eventually we'll probably see the East Asia Summit and APEC will start to twin. So you're still getting this rather European-centric, very funny American argument about can the US president make 2 visits a year to Asia.
You definitely wouldn't see the creation of a regional bloc without the United States president.
No, I don't. And that's the funny part. The Americans are trying to do it in reverse with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it might make sense in Washington, but it sure as hell doesn't make sense on this side of the Pacific. And Mickey Mouse, I love, but whether he needs more than 70 years protection, I don't know. And I think there's a lot of other of those sorts of issues where it's interesting that inside the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is an American-run operation, the Americans have been confronted with some very hard talking from this side of the ocean. Now, whether we're going to be hard enough and smart enough to actually follow through with that is another question. I mean, people that I respect in Washington said they were quite happy when Australia decided to do a free trade negotiation with the United States, because they were confident that Australia, being Australia, would negotiate a world's best practice, high quality free trade agreement that forced the Americans to deal with agriculture and everything else. And they were amazed that in the end, because John Howard wanted a matching relationship, security relationship, economic relationship, what we settled for. That what we settled for instance, on sugar, in the American case, we could settle for with the Japanese on rice, i.e. not in the treaty. Never underestimate the ability of the lawyers to win, but on this one I think there's a lot more to play for. It's going to be an interesting battle.
Perhaps following on from your comments about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and also the fact that you view it as a potential way to contain China and to exclude China from the TPP.
Which is why the Chinese do it.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Not an original thought from me.
Absolutely. So I think it's quite interesting because, as you mentioned in your presentation, the Doha round at the moment is on life support, and I'd be curious to hear your views about the future of the World Trade Organization, and given the fact that you saw APEC's role as being quite significant at bringing about a successful conclusion of the Uruguay round, and the fact that the binding nature of free trade agreements and the TPP has been something that's been seen as detrimental and risky for some. Do you think that there's scope, and do you think that we're actually taking a risk in a way to have so many more binding agreements such as the TPP? Curious as to your thoughts.
Well, I said I could do a trade talk with jokes. You're starting to push the envelope there. I don't know where I'm going to get a joke out of that one. I mean, I think the great significance of the GATT for WTO is that it already looks like tomorrow's world. Okay, it already looks like a world where the developing world, as they were once called, have the same right as veto as the old duopoly, Europe and the United States. So in that sense, the funny thing about the WTO is it actually looks like tomorrow. It actually looks like the sort of world we are going to have to make work. So the WTO, in a way, it replicates the experience that we have in dealing with climate change. It's much more difficult because it's not just the Americans and the French going into the green room and doing a deal. It doesn't work like that. So it's a lot harder. Maybe you have to break it down into, maybe you have to really attack the old nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. Maybe you do have, as Craig Emerson says, start to break it down into much more bite-sized, manageable chunks. Although having said that, you still then get to the really hard chunks. You still get to agriculture and all the rest of it. But I think the beauty of the WTO is that the world did learn some pretty good lessons in the 1930s. MFN does work. This incredible crisis we've just been through, MFN has held up pretty well. And despite the noodle bowl, MFN, most favoured nation, all of those things that very smart people worked out after the Great Depression and after World War II, those sorts of Bretton Woods structures still deliver for all the world. And that's the interesting thing. I mean, from an Asian perspective, the GATT delivered. The GATT delivered fantastically. I mean, that's what they plugged into. And that's what China negotiated for more than a decade. I think it was 11 years that they negotiated to get membership of the GATT. It was of that order. And the party actually ticked off quite huge fundamental internal changes, which actually nibbled at the party. That really proved in a way that the WTO and GATT has got real guts and muscle. If you can make the Chinese Communist Party sign up to deep internal domestic economic changes, then it must have something going for it. And so I don't know that the old Europeanist GATT approach is going to be the way to do it. But as someone who's spent a lot of time in a lot of different parts of Asia, and this is a different speech, confronted by the fact that poverty actually smells. Poverty is actually a lousy way to do life. That what these guys have all signed up to, in a sense, is a much more open, much more globalist, much more prosperous way of doing life. And the WTO, the GATT structure, that Bretton Woods structure, is a large part of what delivered all of that. Economists occasionally do have deep and good insights. Although, having said that, never underestimate the ability of the lawyers, the legislators and the lobbyists to cut them off the pass. I don't know whether that's an answer, but at least it's a free association.
Can we just have perhaps one more question?
No. Okay, Stuart, you get final right of reply.
I was just going to say, you haven't mentioned the prospect of John Howard suddenly discovered China at one of the APEC.
He looked out. He was in the John Howard discovering China. The story that wasn't. I don't think it was 2001 to Shanghai. It was an earlier trip where he opened the hotel blinds at the top of his hotel in Shanghai and looked across at Pudong and turned to his assembled advisors and said, "How long has this been going on?" But I'm pretty sure it wasn't. I've checked the story and I think I know when it happened. But I have, from the most impeccable source, confirmation that is what he said. And again, anything that gets the anything that gets the American president to go to Asia is a good thing. Anything that gets the Australian Prime Minister to go to Asia is a good thing. And the Hanoi APEC 2006 was, to me, one of those moments. We flew afterwards down to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh. We went out to the site of the famous battle of Long. But that night, Howard gave a speech where he made, off the cuff, he actually gave one of those amazingly wonderful Howard speeches. Everybody else went off to do Ho Chi Minh that night, but I stayed to cover the speech. And it was one of those wonderful Howard speeches where the only way to understand it was to imagine Paul Keating being on a dais at the other end of the room. And when Howard started ranting, you had to imagine that Keating was at the other end ranting back at him. Okay? So this is 2006. I mean, he's been in power a decade, but he's still arguing with Keating over the ownership of Asia. And he was going, oh, they said they wouldn't deal with me, blah, blah, blah. But the point that I thought, well, APEC has won, was he said at one stage that Australia was now naturally and irrevocably and permanently part of Asia. Okay? And I rang the cable sub that night and he said, it was a yarn for the morning, he said, what would you think if John Howard says we're a natural part of Asia? And he said, I thought you've got a head on. So we did. So APEC's not too bad when you get the Americans to come to Asia. It's even better when you get the Australians to come to Asia. Or more.
Well, Graeme, thank you very, very much.
We should also congratulate the youngest APECian here, who's done an absolutely fantastic job.
I think it's
doesn't this prove that free trade is just the most wonderful classified thing?
I think one of the really interesting things about having a journalist here is we do get a perspective that we just simply don't get from an academic, we don't get from a politician, we don't get from a diplomat. And we've already thanked you one way. Let's thank him again.